In the spring of 1963, Victor Hanley was 33 years old and entering his 5th year as a diocesan accountant for the Archdiocese of Harrisburg. He had never once deviated from routine. His office drawers were labelled with dates rather than functions. He took his lunch at exactly 11:45 each morning. Tuna sandwich, thermos of tea, single apple slice in wax paper. His world was one of order and known quantities, which made him the perfect candidate for Oakrest. Oakrest Abbey was located 4 hours north of Scranton, nestled deep in the pine barrens that locals called Saints Hollow, though no one could remember exactly why. Established in 1881 by Benedictine missionaries, the abbey had long served as a retreat for priests seeking silence, discipline, and seclusion. Most in the diocese never saw the place. Few were even aware it still functioned. But in January of that year, 3 letters sent to Oakrest had been returned, unopened. A routine stipend payment, mailed on February 5th, remained uncashed. By March, a visiting courier reported finding the gate chained, the grounds quiet, no sign of movement. On April 9th, Hanley was instructed to perform a welfare audit. His task was straightforward: assess the abbey's records, confirm occupancy, and submit a report to the Archdiocese. He was provided with a car, a week's per diem, and a keyring labelled simply Oak 1. He left Harrisburg at dawn. His last known photograph, grainy and overexposed, shows him standing beside the abbey's main gates, staring straight ahead. Not smiling, not posing, just standing, as though waiting to be let in. The gates, in fact, were unlocked when he arrived. Hanley would later describe the drive as unsettling in its sameness. Mile after mile of pine, the road narrowing, his tyres crunching over gravel, then dirt. When he reached the final turn, there were no signs, no cross, no bell, just the stone outline of the abbey's front facade, its slate roof sagging under the weight of moss. There were 12 rooms registered at Oakrest, 12 priests assigned, 12 expected to greet him. He found none. The courtyard was overgrown. Weeds sprouted between the flagstones. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and cold stone. Hanley noted that the front door hung slightly ajar, and the lock bore faint scratches, as if it had been closed and opened repeatedly, but never latched. Inside, the air was still. Dust clung to every surface. In the refectory, the long table was set for a meal that had never been cleared. Bowls of dried oatmeal, spoons resting upright in stiffened milk, a single overturned cup. The benches pushed back unevenly. In the dormitory hall, every bed was made. Robes were folded. A rosary lay neatly across pillowcases. Windows were shut, lamps unplugged. But what disturbed Hanley most, and what would be mentioned twice in his final report, was the silence. Not the kind broken by creaking floorboards or distant wind, but the kind that pressed inward, total, unyielding, as though sound itself had been instructed not to return. When he reached the chapel, he paused. The door was closed, its iron hinges cold to the touch. Inside, 12 candles had been lit, and left to burn down to blackened nubs. The scent of incense was still faint in the air. An open hymnal sat on the organ bench, page corners curled with moisture. Its last notation, lament procession, silent benediction. There was no blood, no broken glass, no overturned furniture, nothing that would suggest panic or violence, only abandonment, the kind that felt rehearsed. At the front of the chapel, the pulpit stood empty. Hanley noticed something scratched into the side, faint, almost lost in the wood grain. He leaned closer. The word was simple, one word, deeply etched. Withdrawn. Not gone, not missing, not fled. Withdrawn. Hanley returned to the administrative office, just past noon. The desk was clean, except for a single leather-bound ledger left open in the centre. The last entry was dated March 6, 1963. It read, "Communion prepared, night scheduled to proceed, no further voice, BL." Those were the initials of Abbot Brendan Lough. He turned the page. The next sheet was blank. every subsequent page remained untouched. Hanley left the abbey shortly after 3 p.m. He drove back to Elkford, the nearest town, a 45-minute descent from the hills, and requested to use the sheriff's line. His call to the archdiocese lasted 17 minutes. The original tape no longer exists, but a microfilm transcript, preserved in the diocesan archive in Harrisburg, offers a window into his state of mind. The first half of the call is procedural. Hanley outlines the layout of the building, confirms the absence of personnel, and requests guidance on whether law enforcement should be contacted. Then the transcript becomes less clear. At minute 11, Hanley's tone shifts. The transcript notes several long silences and what the archivist described as vocal tremor. Hanley, they set it for something. It's like they stepped out mid-step. Pause. Hanley, nothing's damaged, but nothing's been used. It's like they were waiting for silence to start. When pressed by the diocesan contact, Hanley concludes, "It's not what happened there, it's that something made it stop happening." The official diocesan response was cautious. Hanley was instructed to return home, draft a full report, and submit the ledger for archival preservation. A second delegate would be sent within the month. No second delegate was sent. Oakrest Abbey was never reopened. Over the years, Hanley's visit became a footnote in church records, classified under remote audit incomplete. His name would not appear in public diocesan communications again. He retired from church service 2 years later. When interviewed in 1981 by a local historian compiling a book on Benedictine monasteries in Pennsylvania, Hanley declined to speak of Oakrest. He allowed only one quote: "What unsettled me most was not what I saw, but what I knew I should have heard, and didn't." In the decades that followed, Oakrest remained untouched. The gates rusted. Ivy overtook the stonework. Its existence faded from maps and memory, but the ledger, its ink faded, corners warped, remains in Archive Drawer 17B, filed beneath abandoned holdings. It is not available to the public, and on its final page, beneath Abbot Loft's last entry, someone, perhaps Hanley, perhaps another, has scrawled a single additional line in pencil. It reads, "They were not taken, they stopped being seen." There is a common assumption that if evil exists in a place, it leaves behind signs, blood, screams, destruction. But Oakrest left no such trace. No shattered pews, no torn pages, no cries etched into the walls. What it left instead was something far worse, a pattern. In 1973, 10 years after Hanley's visit, a novice historian named Daniel Hurst was conducting a graduate thesis on diocesan budgeting trends. While reviewing financial logs from the early 60s, he found something odd. Invoices for Oakrest Abbey were filed and paid regularly through the spring of 1963, but no payment was ever refused, not even after the priests had vanished. Each month, April, May, June, a routine stipend was mailed from Harrisburg. Each month, the check cleared. For nearly a year, the signatures on the reverse varied, the handwriting deteriorated, but every transaction cleared through a small credit union in Elkford. The account, when finally investigated, had no listed owner. When the bank was merged in 1984, the records were discarded. What disturbed Hurst more was not the financial inconsistency, but what he found in a forgotten folder labelled Maintenance Oakrest Routine. Inside were 2 brief memos addressed to Facilities Oversight. May 14, 1963, Victor reports grounds in good condition. Recommend quarterly lawn care. Candles remain replenished. No rot present. July 6, 1963. All doors secure. Chapel air is still clean. No intrusion detected. There was no signature, no employee code, just brief, typed reports on a monastery the church no longer acknowledged. Hurst submitted his findings. The file was sealed. His thesis was redirected. In his personal notes, he scrawled something beside the last memo. If they left, someone maintained the silence. That's what makes it worse. We know now that Oakrest wasn't the only site with anomalies in that region. In 1965, a nearby forestry team reported finding what they described as a procession of robes nailed to trees, 12 in total, each evenly spaced along a ridge 4 miles south of the abbey. No bodies, no footprints, just garments, sun-bleached, stiffened by time, bearing initials stitched into the collars. TR, CJ, BL. They were never collected. The records were misfiled under vandalism, unknown. Even more disturbing was a 1976 letter, sent anonymously to the Archdiocese. The handwriting was rough, almost illiterate, but the return address was local, an abandoned logging town 20 minutes from Saints Hollow. The letter read, "They hum under the chapel. It's not music, they left the faces in the stone. You can hear them when you kneel too long." The last one walked backwards into the woods. The letter was unsigned. It was never investigated. In 1987, Father Matthias Rourke, a retired priest who had served near Oakrest during its final decade, was interviewed for a regional oral history project. Most of his recollections were innocuous, but when asked directly about the abbey, he became visibly anxious. The interview tape, now part of the university's archive, includes the following exchange. Interviewer: "Did you know any of the men at Oakrest?" Father Rourke: "Knew of them. We were told not to write, not to visit. They said they were practicing old rites, cleansing the voice." Interviewer: "Do you remember when they disappeared?" Father Rourke pauses: "They didn't disappear. They just stopped being priests." Interviewer: "What do you mean?" Father Rourke: "They changed what they worshipped." The statement was later struck from the transcript. To this day, the Archdiocese maintains no wrongdoing. Oakrest Abbey is listed as decommissioned structural concerns. Visitors are discouraged. The forest path is overgrown. There is no signage, no lighting. The only marker is a stone slab beside the entrance gate, worn nearly smooth by rain and time. Its inscription is barely legible: "He who sees silence must not speak." What makes the story of Oakrest endure is not a single atrocity. There were no charred bodies, no confessions, no photographs leaked to the press. What makes it terrifying is the absence, the precision, the total erasure of 12 ordained men without protest or pursuit. There were no search parties, no funeral masses, only a ledger left open on a desk that no one ever touched again. And yet when Hanley returned to his apartment in Harrisburg that night, he locked the door behind him. He unplugged the kitchen clock. He filed his report by hand, not by typewriter, and refused to answer follow-up calls from the diocese. Years later, after his death in 1993, a shoebox was found in his closet. Inside were 3 items: a photocopy of the Oakrest Ledger's final page, a pine needle sealed in plastic, and a cassette tape with the label torn off. The contents, rarely shared, contained 37 minutes of ambient hiss, interrupted only twice, once at minute 17 by what sounds like reversed choral humming, and again at minute 36, a whisper barely audible, 5 words spoken clearly: "Withdrawn, 12 door never open." To this day, Oakrest remains undisturbed, and the ledger, the only official document recovered from the site, sits in climate-controlled silence, still open, still unanswered, and still asking, in the spaces between its pages, how 12 men could vanish without leaving behind even a prayer. By 1958, Oakrest Abbey was already considered an outlier among Benedictine institutions. Located deep in the wooded seclusion of Saints Hollow, it had earned a reputation not for scandal or renown, but for quiet compliance, the kind of obedience that left no trace in diocesan memos, no headlines in Catholic registers. It was a place where silence was not merely practiced, but revered, a place where history was left to rot, quietly beneath ivy and stone. That year, the abbey received its final appointed abbot, Father Brendan Lough, a man known less for his charisma and more for the clarity of his convictions. His theological writings, though sparse, appeared in certain obscure clerical bulletins. One article, published in The Penitent Voice in April of 1956, included a line that would be repeated later in internal communications. God does not require understanding, he requires absence. Father Loach was in his early 40s when he arrived at Oakrest, clean-shaven, thin-framed and often photographed, with his hands clasped behind his back. Former colleagues described him as precise, correct, and unflinching in doctrinal matters. A few, less charitably, described him as a man who prayed not to be heard, but to be erased. His first act as abbot was to eliminate external contact. By September of 1958, Oakrest no longer accepted visitors. Parish confessions, once held bi-weekly for surrounding towns, were discontinued. Letters from family members of the monks began going unanswered. Deliveries were rerouted to a postal station in Elkford, where a lay courier would collect and deposit them behind the Abbey gate. Inside, the changes were more severe. Routine notes compiled from diocesan inspection records show a rapid transformation. Communal meals were reduced in length. Recitation of psalms replaced conversation. The monastery bell was no longer rung for vespers, and in its place, a dull brass bowl was struck once, per service, a sound described by one auditor as like the echo of something closing. More revealing, however, are the fragments recovered from a diary found years later in Vatican storage. The author identified himself only once, Brother Caleb. The diary is not intact, pages are torn, paragraphs repeat, but what survives paints a picture of slow, deliberate deconstruction, not of the church but of the self. August 19th, Brother Peter has been reassigned. He now refers to himself only as 8, I'm to be 6. We are told that names echo pride. September 2nd, we eat in silence now. No more scripture during meals. The sound of chewing is very loud in this place. September 11th, mirrors removed. Father says they are false instruments. We are to know our shape only through touch, or not at all. These entries are not dramatic. There is no mention of pain, no complaint, only documentation, calm, cold, and unwavering. But scattered between them are phrases repeated too often to ignore. God will not look in this direction. Withdrawn from the voice, it stands in Chapel 6. That final phrase appears 4 times. The 6th chapel, one of the smaller rooms off the main corridor, was once used for private prayer. Parish records note it had no windows, only a single hanging lamp. It was reserved, according to earlier abbots, for periods of silence longer than 1 week. But in 1959, a facilities note from the diocese lists the chapel as closed for renovation. There is no record of it reopening, nor is there any mention of what it was being renovated into. By early 1960, monastic routines at Oakrest had shifted entirely. Priests no longer addressed one another with traditional titles. Gone were the daily briefings. Gone were the ceremonial readings. According to one final administrative letter submitted by a visiting health inspector, the men no longer acknowledged the presence of the observer. I spoke to them, the inspector wrote, but they seemed unsure if language was permitted. That same letter, filed under Health and Safety, Oakrest, 1960, included a warning not about the condition of the building, which remained structurally sound, but about the monks' behaviour. Prolonged silence of this nature may constitute a form of psychological atrophy. They are not withdrawing from society, they are withdrawing from sensory life itself. Still, no intervention was made. At the time, the church considered Oakrest an experimental cloister, a place for intense contemplation and theological purity. Bishop Gerald Marnier, in an internal communiqué, referred to the abbey as a sacred cave of unknowing, the monastic ideal taken to completion. That letter, sent in 1961, would be his last official mention of the site. What was happening inside Oakrest was not simply austerity, it was erasure. In a faith built on confession, testimony, and shared sacrament, Oakrest had eliminated the act of speaking. In a hierarchy founded on names, Peter, Paul, Benedict, It had replaced identity with number. And in a church that worshipped through liturgy, the monks at Oakrest had stopped singing altogether. The horror of this transformation lies not in violence, not in screams, but in willing surrender. They were not taken, they were not coerced. They chose silence. They chose disappearance. And the world, seeing nothing overtly wrong, let them do it. What makes this chapter of the Oakrest story uniquely terrifying is that it contains no villain, no bloodied hands, only a doctrine taken to its coldest extreme. Father Brendan Lough did not twist scripture, he applied it. He did not preach heresy, he enforced obedience. What began as monastic reform ended in a kind of metaphysical suicide. And in the stillness of that abbey, as God was silenced and the self dissolved, something else began to take its place. Something that did not require confession, did not demand penance, only stillness. In 1961, the Vatican issued a memorandum titled On Liturgical Integrity in Isolated Orders. Though not addressed to Oakrest by name, the language was unmistakably directed at cloisters like it, communities that had, in recent years, begun distorting the function of silence. It called for measured transparency and the reintroduction of sacred sound, where its absence had become ideologically entrenched. Father Brendan Lough never replied, nor did he alter the practices at Oakrest. Instead, something else changed. The diary of Brother Caleb, once structured in careful lines and dated entries, became irregular. Sentences ran together. The handwriting degraded. But within that decay, something emerged. A different tone, less reflective, more strained, as though the act of writing had become not an expression, but a defiance. I whispered Psalm 6 in my cell, was told not to repeat it. We are no longer permitted supplication. The eye at the lectern is covered now. The velvet is heavier. Father says the mouth is a gate. We are to keep it sealed, even in dream. In one entry, dated simply autumn, Caleb describes an event that breaks the pattern. 2 were removed, numbers 3 and 9, no noise, taken from their beds. I saw robes at the top of the stair, but not the men. This line is underlined 3 times. What makes these entries especially disturbing is the absence of alarm. There is no accusation, no attempt to warn, only an account, blunt, dispassionate, and nearly resigned. Like a clerk recording the passage of time inside a vanishing world. One of the few surviving reports from within the abbey, found decades later in an anonymous box labelled Non-Compliant Houses, includes a brief, unsigned visitor log dated December 2nd, 1961. Entered at 10:04 a.m. Smell of bleach in the hall. One man cleaning the refectory, no shoes, mouth bandaged. Did not look up, organ covered in sheet. Pews rearranged into rows of 11, with gap at front right. No one responded to greeting. The mention of bleach would come up again in later inspections. Not as a cleaning agent, but as an atmospheric detail. Whatever spiritual beliefs were held within Oakrest had taken physical form. Architecture was rearranged, walls restained, crucifixes covered. Chapel 6, once padlocked, was now entirely unlisted in the abbey's internal maps. That space, referenced repeatedly in Brother Caleb's diary, appears only once in official records after 1961. In a facilities note dated February 17, 1962, an anonymous inspection officer wrote, "Chapel 6 repurposed, no altar visible, stone bench installed, ventilation sealed, light is now indirect, purpose unclear, no entry requested." That document is preserved, but redacted. A single line blacked out at the bottom appears to have referenced a Latin inscription on the rear wall. What little remains visible reads, "Qui perit, oculis Dei," which roughly translates, "He who perishes from the eyes of God." By 1962, any remaining structure of a functional monastery had dissolved. No services were held, no records submitted. Financially, Oakrest remained stable. Checks were cashed, receipts returned, but socially the site had gone dark. And yet no emergency was declared. no Vatican sanction issued, because Oakrest had not broken any law. It had simply stopped being visible. This is the precise moment when the horror of the Oakrest story comes into full view, not in violence or spectacle, but in invisibility. 12 men lived, breathed, and walked within those stone walls. They obeyed every rule, surrendered every name, and erased every ritual, not out of defiance, but out of faith. And the church, seeing only discipline and austerity, allowed it. They were not punished for heresy. They were not labelled apostates. They simply folded inward, further and further, until what remained was no longer recognisable. Brother Caleb's final entry, found on a half page with frayed edges, is written in graphite, barely legible. It does not read like a warning, it reads like a farewell. The chapel is full now, 11 at rest. I remain for the final hour, no mirror, no voice. The silence has found its answer. He signed it. 6. What followed in the months ahead remains a blur of incomplete documentation and quiet omission. But one fact is irrefutable. By the spring of 1963, all 12 resident clergy had vanished from public life. No bodies, no burial, no official notice, only silence, and the faint scent of bleach. If history judges the horrors of Oakrest, it will not be for what it did, but for what it was allowed to become. An institution so bent toward obedience that it erased itself. A doctrine so rigid it mistook stillness for sanctity. And a church so used to compliance, it failed to notice when faith became something else entirely. Something wordless, something hollow, and something that, in the darkened breath between prayer and penance, was never meant to be heard. In the spring of 1960, Oakrest Abbey remained structurally intact. From the outside, it gave no appearance of deterioration. Its walls held firm, its roof was stable. Its floors, though creaking with age, had borne the weight of Benedictine life for nearly 80 years. But inside, things had begun to shift. That April, an independent architect named Clara Ridge was contracted by the Diocese of Harrisburg. Her assignment was clear: assess moisture intrusion in the Abbey's lower levels. Multiple complaints had surfaced in prior years regarding mould and foundation seepage, and the Abbey's increasing isolation made internal inspections rare. Ridge, a graduate of Drexel University's School of Architecture, had previously worked on several cathedral restorations. Her reports were known for their thoroughness. She kept clean ledgers, annotated sketches, and cross-referenced architectural plans with facility logs. Her initial notes on Oakrest, now archived in a thin manila folder at the Diocesan Records Office, seem ordinary at first. Main hall beams are structurally sound, basement humidity at 62%. South corridor shows minor stone warping. Recommend resin injection. But 2 days into the inspection, her tone began to change. The following appears in the margin of a field sketch. North stairwell descends further than floor plan, indicates. Extra 7 steps, not listed on 1912 blueprint. It wasn't unusual for old abbeys to include undocumented renovations. But Ridge had a habit, learned early in her career, of knocking on every wall, not for echo or soundness, but for silence. Areas that responded with no resonance, often masked hollows, false panels, or sealed chambers. It was beneath the East Wing Chapel, the one referred to only as 6 in Brother Caleb's diary, that she found something wrong. Her report, dated April 11th, included the following: trapdoor beneath altar, hidden beneath stone tile, irregular seam pattern, cement newer than surrounding flooring, unsealed with chisel. What she uncovered was not an ordinary crawl space. It was a sealed door, stone, arched, reinforced with iron dowels. It bore no handle, no inscription, just a faint cross-shaped indentation, worn smooth, as if brushed by many hands over time. The air beneath was cooler, not the natural damp of a cellar, but a heavier cold, still and without scent. Ridge, trained in historical preservation, noted that the craftsmanship did not match the rest of the abbey. The stones had a finer grain, the mortar was darker, and most notably, the arch was misaligned by exactly 13 degrees. She marked it, measured it, and took 2 photographs. Neither developed correctly. The first returned as a blank strip, fogged over as if exposed. The second showed the room, but not the door. Where the arch should have been, there was only the chapel floor. Even the seam in the stone had vanished in the print. She mentioned this to one of the monks, a man she would later identify only as Brother Four. His face, she wrote, was pale, his eyes dull. He listened, then turned away. His only reply, "We do not go down there anymore." She noted the phrasing, not "we are forbidden," not "it is sealed," but "we do not go," as if it had once been common. 2 days later, her formal inspection ended, but Clara did not return directly to Harrisburg. Instead, she extended her stay, citing archival discrepancies in her report. She spent an additional 3 days alone at the abbey, walking the perimeter, sketching stone patterns, and cataloguing minor anomalies. On the morning of April 17th, she signed out of the guest ledger and left no forwarding address. Her final report was never submitted. What remains are fragments, saved, it seems, not for posterity, but for personal warning. In 1994, more than 3 decades later, a box labelled Estate Dispute Ridge surfaced during the liquidation of her family's property in Allegheny County. Among the personal tax records and family correspondences was a water-damaged envelope marked "Do Not Forward." Inside was an unsent letter addressed to her younger sister, Marion. The ink was faded, the pages warped, but its contents changed how Oakrest would be remembered. "Marion, I haven't slept in 2 days. I know how this will sound. I almost didn't write, but you need to know why I'm not coming home. They don't speak at night, but they sing. I heard it twice. I thought it was a record player, but it came from beneath the floor. It wasn't Latin. I know Latin." It was reversed. The sound was wet, but it echoed. The chant looped on itself. I stood by the chapel and listened for over an hour. I think they knew. The next morning, I found my tools placed in a neat pile outside the stairwell. I hadn't left them there. There's something behind that door, Marion. It's not storage, and it was never meant to be opened from this side. The letter was never mailed. It remains the only first-hand testimony regarding the sealed chamber beneath Chapel 6. What followed is not clearly documented. Clara Ridge left public architecture in 1961. She moved to a coastal town in Oregon, where she lived in relative obscurity until her death in 1989. She never married, never published. Her obituary, printed in a local newspaper, lists her only known profession as educator. But the door she discovered, and the implications of its presence, would linger in whispered diocesan records for years. What is most chilling is not the door itself, it's what it represents. In most ecclesiastical architecture, sacred spaces are designed to elevate. Churches rise, windows stretch upward, bells ring skyward, but Oakrest in its final years inverted that instinct. Rooms were darkened, symbols were hidden, and beneath it all, something was buried. The sealed door beneath Chapel 6 is not an accident of design. It is a boundary, not between rooms, but between purposes. And whatever that purpose was, it had nothing to do with worship. In 1962, the diocese issued an internal document titled Facilities Reassessment, Tier 4 Sites. Oakrest Abbey was listed as active monastic, with a footnote stating basement access sealed at the discretion of abbot, non-intrusive, structural irregularities. No further action recommended. This phrasing, vague and evasive, reveals the quiet logic that surrounded Oakrest in its final years. The church didn't investigate what it couldn't categorise, and Father Brendan Luff, as abbot, had full authority to define which areas of the abbey were deemed sacred or forbidden. That same year, a facilities assistant named Gregory Mullen visited Oakrest to collect a stained glass panel from a decommissioned hall. His route required him to pass through the eastern cloister, and in his post-visit expense log, he made an offhand note that was never meant for review. Left via side corridor, heard music I couldn't place, thought it was organ tuning, very slow, like underwater. Didn't sound like worship because it was dismissed, not archived under anything significant, but this note, when cross-referenced with Ridge's unsent letter, adds weight to a chilling possibility. The singing didn't stop when Oakrest shut its doors. It may have grown quieter, less frequent, but it never fully ceased. There's also the matter of the photographs. In 1998, a graduate student researching Gothic acoustics contacted the diocese requesting permission to study Oakrest's design. His request was denied, but a clerk at the archives, unaware of the restriction, provided him a scanned folder from the Ridge report. Within that folder were 8 photos. 7 were mundane, stone walls, ceiling supports, humidity damage. But the 8th was different. It showed the interior of Chapel 6, dimly lit with only the faint glow of a side candle, and at its centre, something impossible to misinterpret. A narrow iron loop embedded in the floor. There was no explanation in the accompanying notes, no scale indicator, no date, but the loop, black worn and oddly polished, suggested function, use, as if it had once been part of something that opened or something that held. The student, unnerved by what he saw, submitted a summary of his findings to his thesis advisor, but never pursued the topic further. His email ended with a single line: "Whatever Oakrests sealed, they did it quietly, but not entirely." Years later, during a 2004 archival overhaul, that folder was marked Restricted Closed Inquiry. It hasn't been accessed since. What becomes clear when examining Oakrest's final structural records is that the building was not decaying, it was transitioning. Plumbing rerouted, heating ducts closed off, entryways narrowed, windows in certain rooms were bricked over from the inside. One shipment of supplies, billed in 1961, included industrial-grade iron reinforcements, but no corresponding construction permit was ever filed. The only plausible conclusion is that the Abbey was preparing for containment. But containment of what? That question, deliberately left unanswered, formed the basis of a short-lived Vatican Review Committee in 1972. Known unofficially as the Obscured Sites Committee, their task was to evaluate cloisters that had deviated from theological norms in the post-war period. Oakrest appeared on their list. The notes from that investigation, partially declassified in 2011, describe the Abbey as follows: externally undisturbed, internally transformed, presence of unauthorized modifications. Primary concern is not physical decay, but doctrinal inversion. Spiritual focus appears redirected downward, not metaphorically, but spatially. Architectural intent unclear, avoid contact. The phrase doctrinal inversion appears 3 times in the file. It is not explained. One reviewer, writing anonymously in the margin, scrawled a single note next to the Chapel 6 entry. What were they keeping in? What makes this chapter of the Oakrest story especially disturbing is not the presence of a secret door. Such features exist in countless old religious structures. It's that the monks refuse to acknowledge it, not in denial, not in ignorance, but in ritual. They stopped referencing the space, stopped walking near it, reoriented their beds and pews so that no one ever faced its direction, as if the act of acknowledgement itself had become sacrilegious, as if they had made a pact, not to conceal something, but to forget it. And Clara Ridge, an outsider, had broken that pact. She knocked where no one else would. She looked at what no one else named, and what she found or heard left her silent for the rest of her life. Her story is not one of dramatic revelation. There was no press release, no confrontation, just a door sealed beneath a forgotten chapel, and a woman who recognized that sometimes architectural silence is not the absence of noise. It's a design, a warning. The horror of Oakrest lies not in any single act, not in violence or blood or ruin. It lies in careful subtraction, in removal by choice, in a community of men who believed, devoutly, that divinity no longer looked upward, but downward, that beneath the altar there was something holy that had no name, and no need for light. Clara Ridge never returned to Oakrest. No one has entered Chapel 6 since the day she left, and the door, still buried beneath the floor, remains untouched, sealed, not by mortar alone, but by something older, something shaped by silence, guarded by ritual, and forgotten by design, something that waits. In the spring of 1971, archivist Dr. Henry Absalom began a standard inventory of the media vault beneath St. Cyprian's Seminary in Albany, New York. The collection housed thousands of ecclesiastical recordings, chants, homilies, liturgical lectures, all stored on brittle, reel-to-reel tapes in rows of mismatched boxes. Many had never been listened to. Most were labelled with little more than date and format. It was not unusual work. The tapes had sat dormant for decades, and Dr. Absalom, a quiet man known for his cataloguing discipline, was tasked with digitizing them before moisture claimed what was left. What he found instead would never be digitized. Tape 276A, marked simply Gregorian Studies, 1962, Oakrest, was housed in a nondescript cardboard sleeve. The label had been written in faint red pencil, as if added later. When Absalom threaded the reel into the playback machine and began listening, he heard no chant, no liturgy, no recognizable melody. Instead, he heard a man's voice, calm, precise, unwavering. It was not reading scripture, it was reading names, then behaviours, then outcomes. The voice matched recordings of Father Brendan Lough, confirmed by voice print comparison, performed later by linguistics professor Melinda Crass at Holywell College. There was no background noise, no ambient hiss, just Father Lough, listing what can only be described as clinical observations. Subject 1, non-verbal, remains kneeling, attempts to vocalize produce no measurable sound. Subject 4, Psalm 51 recitation, absence of vocal cords confirmed, mouth moved in full syllabic rhythm. Subject 7, points to east wall, when presented with candlelight, blindfold applied, behaviour continues. The tone was not reverent, it was reporting. At first, Absalom assumed it was some form of theological exercise, perhaps allegorical or metaphorical, a dramatization meant for seminary training. Then he heard a phrase that changed everything. Subject 9, removed, record ends. There was no inflection, no explanation. The voice did not pause, it simply moved on. Subject 10, stares at stone, does not respond to Latin, Aramaic, or silence. Continues until eyes begin to bleed. The language was not scriptural, it was procedural. Absalom stopped the tape. He removed the reel and checked the box again. There was a second tape, 276B, filed beneath the first, also labelled Gregorian Studies, but this time dated 1963. The final year Oakrest Abbey was known to be occupied. This one was shorter. 17 minutes according to the faded index card clipped to the reel. But only 14 were audible, the last 3 were blank, or erased. The contents were worse. Father Lough's voice was distorted, not electronically, but physically. He was out of breath, as if reciting while pacing. The delivery was erratic, and the subjects, no longer numbered, were described in fragmented form. Does not blink. Faces alter with mouth open. Hair has fallen out. No resistance. Hands-bound recitation of inverted psalms began spontaneously, corrected at 3:40 a.m. with removal. Abbot presence no longer required. Room observes itself. That final phrase appears twice. Room observes itself. Absalom transcribed everything. He logged both reels, sealed them, and filed an incident report, but the seminary responded with a directive to cease transcription immediately and return the tapes to vault storage. When he requested clarification, he received a memo, unsigned, instructing him that historical materials of anomalous nature were to be segregated and unlisted. The tapes were never acknowledged again. But Absalom had made copies, and one of those copies, a partial reel wrapped in aluminum foil, was sent discreetly to Dr. Edwin Farrell, a former professor of dogmatic theology, an outspoken critic of church archival practices. Farrell, intrigued by the tape's content, played them for a closed circle of theologians in early 1972. What emerged from that meeting was a whispered theory. They began referring to Oakrest not as a monastery, but as a trial site, a controlled environment in which something was being measured, altered, or suppressed. Not for public study, not for ecclesiastical knowledge, but for containment. Dr. Farrell's notes from those sessions, preserved in his personal archive, reveal his unease. The cadence is wrong. This was not recorded for analysis. It was dictated for record keeping, as though the speaker expected no audience. It is not a prayer, it is a log. And what is being logged is not human behaviour, it is conditioned compliance. The use of the word subject, rather than brother or father, stripped the priests of any identity. They were being observed, not for improvement, not for penance, but for what? What made this evidence so disturbing was not just the language, but what it implied, that the silence of Oakrest had been engineered, that obedience had become not just a way of life, but a testable variable. Across both reels, the pattern became unmistakable. The subjects do not resist, they do not respond to pain, they stop speaking, even when prompted. And when a response is deemed incorrect, the word removed is used. But nowhere in either tape is the removal described. There is no sound of doors opening, no footsteps, no struggle, just absence. This silence, clinical, procedural, final, haunted the theologians who heard it. It suggested that whatever happened in Oakrest was not passive, it was documented, repeated, measured. It was deliberate. Years later, in 1983, an anonymous package was delivered to a seminary in Baltimore. It contained a photocopy of the Oakrest tape transcript, a diagram labelled Chapel 6, Lower Access, and a single-line note typed on onion paper. The chanting has stopped, but the room still observes. The package bore no return address. It was burned before the day ended, but the copy survived, passed quietly through fringe academic circles, referenced in whispered lectures, and eventually buried again. No new information would surface until 1999, when a now declassified Vatican brief titled Assessment of Behavioural Drift in Isolated Cloisters included a redacted annex with familiar phrasing. See Subject 7, Consistent Directional Orientation, Non-Cognitive Recognition of Magnetic Field Disruption. Movement persists, post-auditory removal. The term post-auditory removal appears nowhere else in theological literature, nor does directional orientation correlate with known spiritual doctrine. These are not religious terms, they are experimental ones. What makes this chapter so devastating is not what the tapes reveal, but what they confirm. The priests of Oakrest were not simply silenced, they were monitored, transformed, and when their transformation no longer served a function, they were removed, not murdered, not executed, removed, as if taken from one phase of study to another. And Father Brendan Lough, far from being a reclusive ascetic, emerges instead as a figure of meticulous record, not a worshipper, but a warden, not offering mass, but marking data. A man who, over 5 years, turned 12 priests into subjects and then into entries. What remains of the Oakrest tapes is sealed. The original reels were allegedly reclaimed by Vatican agents and returned to Rome under diplomatic seal. Their current location is unknown. Their contents officially do not exist. But the copies, the fragments, survive in footnotes, in faded transcripts, and in the memory of those few who heard them. And what they heard was not human suffering, it was human compliance, refined, recorded, and then withdrawn. The tapes that shouldn't exist do exist, and they leave behind a question more chilling than any sound. What exactly was being recorded, and why did it need to be silenced? On the morning of February 17, 1963, just 6 weeks before Victor Hanley's arrival, at Oakrest Abbey. A woman named Elise O'Connor filed a statement with the Elkford Town Police. The incident, noted by Officer Gerald Reeves at 9:32 a.m, was originally recorded as a non-criminal disturbance. The setting was Elkford's train depot, a modest, weather-worn platform on the north end of town, serviced by 2 eastbound routes and 1 freight line. That morning, O'Connor was returning from visiting her sister in Reading. The temperature was just below freezing, and the wind came off the ridgeline in sharp bursts. She was alone on the bench when she saw him. The man approached from the tree line, not from the road, not from the gravel path. He emerged from the woods bordering the tracks, pale, tall, wearing a black clerical overcoat 2 sizes too large. The collar was torn, no shoes. He spoke softly, deliberately. The sentence, repeated by O'Connor 3 times in her deposition, was, "How many stopped looking at the sky?" He asked it once, then again, and again. He had no luggage, no wallet, but he wore a paper hospital band around his wrist, smudged, partially torn, the ink illegible, except for the last 4 letters, R-E-E-D. When Officer Reeves arrived at the station, the man was gone. O'Connor was visibly shaken, but coherent. She insisted the man had not threatened her, only stood near her, repeating the question. And he smelled, she said, not of alcohol or sweat, but of incense and bleach. At the time, no further action was taken. The report was filed, and the case marked no known subject. That would have been the end of it, just another forgotten footnote in a rural department ledger, had it not been for a local historian named Rebecca Mearns, who, in 1975, began compiling a photographic record of Elkford's religious community. When she showed O'Connor a collection of old clergy portraits to identify early abbots and local priests, the woman paused at the 4th image. She tapped the photograph twice, then covered her mouth. The image was labelled Brother Thomas Reed, Oakrest Abbey, ordained 1955, presumed deceased 1961. The church had quietly listed Reed as absent from duty in early 1962. No public death notice was published, no funeral held. The Oakrest records from that year, already sparse, offered no explanation. And yet O'Connor was unwavering in her identification. That was him. He looked dead in the eyes, like he'd forgotten what people looked like. This identification prompted an informal inquiry by Deputy Howard Kinney, who visited the Abbey the following afternoon. His journal, recovered from a personal storage unit years later, includes a terse description. Arrived 4:40 p.m, gate closed, bell unresponsive, called out. Male voice responded from within, said, "There are no men here." Requested entry, refused, voice repeated phrase, "There are no men here." Kinney returned to Elkford and filed a verbal update to Sheriff Alvin Coyle. No further action was taken, but the phrase stuck with him. There are no men here. Not no one is home, not go away, but a denial of humanity, a denial of presence. And it had been spoken, unmistakably, by a man. Thomas Reed had entered Oakrest in 1953 at the age of 26. Seminary records described him as quiet, capable, deferential. He wrote little, had no disciplinary infractions. His theology scores were average. His medical chart, dated 1958, includes a curious entry by the attending friar, shows unusual sensitivity to environmental silence, reports vivid dreams involving geometric absence. No further elaboration is provided. His final, known letter, addressed to his sister Marianne in October 1960, included a brief but unsettling sentence. "The days here feel folded. We speak less now. There is a new rhythm, but it isn't ours." After that, there is no record of correspondence. He was, by all measures, erased, until Elkford. If the man Elise O'Connor saw was indeed Brother Reed, then the implications are staggering. Not just because one of the 12 had surfaced again, but because he was let out. He wasn't fleeing, he wasn't hiding. He walked openly into town, wearing a hospital band, asking impossible questions, and then disappeared again. Why would someone, after years of imposed silence, choose their first words to be, "How many stopped looking at the sky?" The phrase has no documented liturgical use. It appears in no hymns, no known scripture. But it does appear, indirectly, in the private margins of a theological journal confiscated from Oakrest during a late-stage audit. In the lower corner of a torn index page, barely legible in pencil. When the eyes leave the sky, the voice follows. A fragment, a warning, a theory. It is this possibility that disturbed investigators decades later. That Reed's statement was not madness, but doctrine. A coded phrase taught or conditioned during his time beneath Oakrest. If so, it means the monks had replaced outward prayer with something directional, not upward toward God, but inward or downward. A theology not of ascension, but of removal. Reed had survived something, but what he returned to was not help. He spoke only once, then vanished. No further sightings were confirmed, no body was found. No hospital in the region reported missing patients matching his description. The paper band he wore, the only tangible proof of his appearance, was never recovered. In 1992, a former Elkford librarian named Susan Callahan published a privately circulated pamphlet titled The Silent Men of Saints Hollow. In it, she re-examines the February 1963 incident and includes a previously unreleased photo taken at the depot that morning. The image is blurry, the platform is mostly empty, but at the edge of the frame, near the tree line, a thin figure is visible. His head is turned away, but he appears to be holding something. Callahan used magnification and contrast enhancement to isolate the object. It was a small cloth pouch, the kind used by Benedictines to carry relic fragments or rosaries. But the pouch was open and empty. What makes this chapter so tragic is not merely the possibility that Reed escaped, but that even in his escape, he remained bound. Bound to language he couldn't explain, bound to ritual he couldn't unlearn, bound, perhaps, to a silence that followed him out of the Abbey and into the world. His appearance was not freedom, it was leakage, a brief accidental rupture in a sealed system, and whatever he was trying to say, if he was trying to say anything at all, could not survive the light of day. Elise O'Connor died in 1985. Her testimony was never retracted. Her original statement remains on file in the Elkford Police Archive, under a category now labelled Historic Religious Encounter. That label is generous. More accurately, what she saw was not an encounter, but an aftermath. The walking result of something that had been done, carefully, quietly, and with absolute conviction, behind the sealed doors of Oakrest. And for a moment, just one cold morning at a train station, the silence blinked and looked back. In the winter of 1996, deep inside the Vatican Secret Archives, now formally renamed the Apostolic Archive, a minor clerical audit uncovered a misfiled translation request labelled Doctrine Reclassification, Oakrest Codex. The envelope had been folded and refolded so many times its edges were feathered. The original red wax seal had broken decades prior, replaced with a strip of aging tape. It bore no stamp of urgency, no code for sensitive handling. The only identifying mark was a faded routing number and a handwritten note in Italian. Reviewed, no action, partial denial. Inside were 27 sheets of onion skin paper, translations from what appeared to be an original Latin manuscript, attributed to an unknown author, and marked Internal Use Only, Oakrest Doctrine Fragment, retrieved 1962, source unclear. The wording was vague, no location listed, no chain of custody, but across each page were wide black ink strokes, redactions, obscuring entire sentences, entire paragraphs. Some pages were almost fully blacked out, but certain lines had been spared. They had survived. They had been left behind. One of the first legible phrases appeared midway through page 4. The soul must be silenced before it is seen. Not saved, not purified, silenced. The language was clinical, devoid of compassion. The line reads not as guidance, but as requirement, a prerequisite for something else. This phrasing alone set off alarms among the researchers. The soul, in traditional Catholic doctrine, is meant to be understood through confession, prayer, and reflection. It is made visible through acts of grace, not through silence. But the Oakrest fragment suggested something darker. That silence wasn't a practice, it was a tool, a method by which the soul could be prepared for observation. As the pages continue, the redactions grow heavier, as if the translator themselves became uncertain of what they were handling. But other fragments survived. Page 9 near the centre, where the echo does not return, there is the answer. An inversion of theology. In most scripture, divine revelation comes through call and response. Man speaks, God answers. But this line implies the opposite, that the absence of response, the void, is itself sacred. That truth is not heard, it is felt when nothing comes back. Another intact phrase appears just before a torn section of page 14. He who kneels without breath is closer than the one who prays aloud. That line violates centuries of ecclesiastical understanding. Breath and word are central to Christian ritual. The Logos, the Word made flesh. Chant, prayer, liturgy, all are spoken affirmations of belief. But here we are told that breathlessness is closeness. Stillness, silence, and immobility are not expressions of reverence. They are measurements of proximity to something greater, something watching, something waiting. By page 21, the fragments shift in tone. They become instructional, not devotional. One phrase left intact and underlined. The eyes must be lowered, the tongue must be still. The gate will open only for those already gone. Again, the language is precise. Already gone, not dead, not holy, gone. The implication is haunting, that a person must be emptied, erased, to be worthy of passage. That whatever Oakrest was preparing for required non-presence. That the only acceptable offering was silence perfected. The most disturbing line appears at the bottom of page 25, a phrase that breaks from the formatting of the others. It is set apart, as if quoted or cited. The first priest was not man. There is no context, no explanation, just that. The first priest, the original intermediary, the first one to stand between the sacred and the profane, and it wasn't human. This contradicts everything the Church teaches about priesthood. The idea that men are appointed as vessels of divine will, trained and anointed to intercede on behalf of others. But Oakrest's doctrine hints at a different lineage, that long before men were ordained, something else had already taken the role. And whatever that something was, it had returned, or been remembered, in Oakrest. What makes this scene of the Oakrest saga uniquely disturbing is that the document was not classified as heresy. It was filed, indexed, stamped, and buried in paperwork, meaning that someone read it, someone reviewed it, understood it, and still chose not to destroy it. Because perhaps, to those few in power, the Codex wasn't dangerous, it was necessary. Historical investigation into the Oakrest Codex reveals that it was likely extracted from the Abbey in late 1962, during the unexplained absence of Brother Thomas Reed. Whether it was smuggled out by Reed himself or retrieved through internal channels remains unknown. But a cross-reference of Vatican translation, request logs from the same year, shows something chilling. Just 1 week after the Codex was submitted, a requisition order was placed for 12 silence containment implements, a phrase used only one other time in the Church's long history. In 1935, during the Vatican's internal response to the Garabandal disturbance in Spain, where 4 young girls claimed to receive visions from silent beings with no faces. The implements, their function never described, were ordered for reinforcement of internal obedience protocols. All 12 were shipped to Saints Hollow, Pennsylvania. It becomes clear then that by 1962, the Church had not only accepted the Codex as legitimate, it had acted on it. The priests of Oakrest were not merely engaging in theological silence, they were being prepared, conditioned, reclassified. And what the Codex outlines is not a guide to salvation, but to submission. Not to God, not to Christ, but to the absence itself. A later Vatican memorandum, dated 1974 and classified under Doctrinal Variants, Peripheral Orders, includes a brief note on Oakrest: ecclesiastical silence maintained. Abbot doctrine, retroactively defined as contemplative abstraction. Codex retained for linguistic interest only. Chapel 6 listed as deconsecrated by dormancy. That phrase, retained for linguistic interest only, is a chilling euphemism. It is the Church's way of acknowledging truth without obligation. Because once a doctrine like this is discovered, one that reframes silence as sanctity, erasure as purity, and obedience as a gate to something non-human, it cannot be unlearned. Only hidden, only redacted. But the horror of Oakrest isn't just the words on the page, it's what those words replaced. The Codex didn't just add new theology, it rewrote the purpose of the priesthood. It turned prayer into programming. It reframed isolation not as suffering, but as progress. And the men who followed it, whether willingly or broken into compliance, became something else. They stopped speaking, they stopped praying, they stopped resisting, and then one by one, they stopped being seen. In 2007, a theologian named Marcus Dell gave a private lecture at a closed conference in Vienna. His topic was unlisted. Attendees were required to surrender recording devices. The only surviving notes were handwritten by an anonymous participant. One line transcribed from memory is now all that remains of the presentation. If the first priest was not man, then the first Mass was not for us. And that's the true horror of the Oakrest Codex. Not that it was written, not that it was believed, but that it was practiced. And beneath the floor of Chapel 6, in the cold dark of that buried room, 12 priests knelt in silence, not to be saved, not to be heard, but to be seen by something that never spoke back. The town of Oakrest by 1963 had already stopped asking questions about the abbey. The children didn't walk past its gate, the bakery had stopped supplying bread, and the postmaster, an aging man named Alvin Cord, returned every envelope addressed to the clergy with a single phrase stamped in red: not known at this address, but the church still knew, and the church was still watching. On February 28, 1963, an internal Vatican memorandum was circulated quietly through the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. It referenced Oakrest event, reconciliation procedure, Phase 5, scheduled for 6th March. There were no names, only initials, and in the lower margin, a signature had been blotted out twice. The event in question was not officially recorded, no Mass was announced, no bells rang. But at 12:04 a.m. on March 6th, surveillance footage, obtained years later through a Freedom of Information request filed by a journalist named Ellis Dreyer, shows a flickering, grainy feed from a motion-triggered camera placed by state fire inspectors before the property was due for demolition. That footage was never meant to be reviewed. The inspector's report simply noted the system as malfunctioning, and yet when viewed frame by frame, it documents the final recorded gathering inside the Oakrest Chapel. The footage is static heavy, but certain facts are unmistakable. The pews are filled, every one. There are no faces, no motion, and only silhouettes fixed in place as though seated for a portrait taken in total darkness. The altar candles, traditionally white, burn a sickening pitch black. Not wax, as later analysis would suggest, something thicker, viscous. When the footage is paused at 12:11 a.m, the candles flare, not flicker, almost like something within them was reacting to movement not visible on the frame. The presiding figure is not listed on any church registry. No priest from the Vatican, no known monk, no assistant clergy. And yet someone clearly officiates. They wear a reversed chasuble, black lining outward, gold against the body. The book they read from is visibly bound in red leather, but with no discernible Latin or Greek. Every page seen in the footage is blank. Witness testimony comes from only one source, a man named Brother Caleb, whose torn journal was discovered inside the walls of his assigned quarters during the 1979 inventory sweep. Pages had been burned, others soaked in what archivists described as proteinaceous fluid. But the remaining legible entries correspond to the date of the final service. There was no sermon, but we were spoken to. Each word was louder than the last, though no sound ever touched the air. It entered us, or we entered it. That sentence is underlined twice, with a single annotation in the margin: he is not a man. Another entry, likely written moments after, reads, "Candles cracked. I felt heat behind my eyes. When I closed them, the hymn was in the walls. Not sung, written, like chalk being dragged under the floorboards." Medical notes recovered from Brother Caleb's later transfer to St. Aldrich's Infirmary suggest severe optic nerve damage. He was admitted blind, blood vessels in both retinas burst, no trauma to the skull. When asked what happened, his only response was, "He took light out of me." He died 6 days later. According to hospital documentation, Brother Caleb's final words were, "The pews stayed full, they always were. We were never the ones worshipping." The Vatican's declassified files, parts of which were forcibly released in the 1982 Ecclesiastical Abuse Inquiry, include a stamped document titled Oakrest Finalization, Full Circle Entry Completed. The phrase "full circle" appears repeatedly across different institutions tied to Oakrest, including the early mental health assessments at Harrowick, the instruction notes in the Sable Cross case, and 3 separate monastic closure reports spanning from 1947 to 1972. No official translation has ever been provided for what full circle entails. But in this context, it marked the final Mass, the cessation of all official activity at Oakrest Abbey, and a non-public burial entry for item 22 on a ledger that contains no other identifying details. No bodies were recovered from the abbey. But on March 8th, 2 days after the final Mass, locals reported the sudden appearance of fresh soil disturbances across the rear courtyard. There were 13 shallow depressions, too uniform to be animal, too shallow for graves, yet disturbed deliberately. The Department of Forestry, which briefly investigated the grounds, sealed the perimeter due to risk of sinkhole development. No further inquiry was made. And yet the tape remains. In its final frame, as the camera feed crackles into static, a figure appears behind the altar, not standing, rising, as if from underneath the pulpit, without disturbing a single object around it. There is no face, no vestments, no arms visible, only the outline of something vertical, dark and impossibly narrow, a kind of silhouette against the candle flare. And for exactly 3 seconds, all shapes in the pews lean forward, synchronized, like marionettes pulled by one invisible cord. When they return upright, the candles extinguish. Not one by one, all at once. The screen goes black. That was the last time anyone entered Oakrest Abbey as a cleric. Later, court-ordered excavations revealed no human remains, no trace of those on the church's missing registry, and no surviving text from the red book seen on the altar. The object itself, if it ever existed, outside the recording, was never found. The terrifying truth suggested by this footage, and confirmed through corroborated journals, hospital files, and institutional records, is that Oakrest was never a sanctuary. It was a vessel. Whatever was welcomed that night, it had always been meant to arrive. The monks were not witnesses. They were not even participants. They were the invitation, and the pews were never meant for them. As the abbey was finally demolished in the spring of 1975, the demolition crew refused to finish the job. Half the nave remains standing to this day, sealed behind iron scaffolding, not for preservation, but to ensure that nothing inside steps out again. Next, we trace the final communication sent from Oakrest's sealed records, a single postcard mailed without a stamp, without a return address. Its message? Just one sentence, handwritten in ink darker than the card itself. The first priest was not man. Oakrest Abbey was never demolished, not officially, not legally, and not in any recorded contract, ledger, or diocese transfer. In 1975, an order was issued for the grounds to be cleared. A demolition company, Enoch and Sons of Wilkes Barre, was contracted and paid in full. Equipment was delivered, a perimeter was marked, but when the crew arrived, something changed. The foreman, Harold Spence, left a written note in his company log. It reads, "Team refuses to enter the chapel. Doors sealed, no entry possible. Structure shows no resistance to rot, but interior temperature dropped 14 degrees at threshold. Assigning hazard classification. Passive, unknown." The site was left untouched. To this day, if you walk through the tree line northeast of Oakrest Hollow, where the road thins and the map turns blank, you'll find it, still standing. The bell tower intact. The windows, though caked in dirt and rain-spotted residue, are unbroken. No graffiti, no vandalism, no sign that anyone has tried to enter in decades. But someone did. In 1997, freelance journalist Rena Holtz submitted a small, unpublished article draft to the Pennsylvania Religious Historical Quarterly. It was flagged and rejected due to unverified claims and illegal trespass. The submission included grainy photographs and 2 paragraphs of copy. The images have never been released to the public. The file, recovered through a 2009 records request, includes the following typed paragraph. Inside, everything was still, not decayed and still. The beds were made, the books remained open to the same passages found in the 1961 inventory. Dust was layered, but untouched by wind. The dining plates were empty, but set. One candle on the chapel altar had melted fully into a wax ring, hardened and fused to the stone. The smell of lavender, faint but persistent, filled the air like it had been sealed in. Her final note before the file was closed reads, "There were no birds, no insects, only silence." And then, once, a sound, like Gregorian chant, reversed, low and slow, coming from under the chapel floor. She left that night. 2 months later, she withdrew her press credentials. She left the profession entirely. Her apartment was vacated mid-lease. Her whereabouts remain unknown. The church has made no official statement on Oakrest since 1975. The diocese it once belonged to was quietly dissolved in 1982, merged into an administrative district with no physical office. Property ownership remains in legal limbo, not seized, not sold, not condemned, just listed as pending custodial decision, Class D. A former diocesan secretary, speaking anonymously in a 2015 interview, stated, "Some doors in the church aren't locked, they're left ajar, so you never ask what's behind them." To understand the horror of Oakrest, you must let go of spectacle. There was no fire, no public scandal, no final sermon broadcast across the airwaves. Just the slow institutional burial of what was too strange, too layered, and too irreconcilable to ever explain. The silence wasn't just after the fact, it was part of the design, and in that silence, a different kind of legacy grew. Not of memory, but of omission. Schools were never built near the site, trails rerouted. The name Oakrest vanished from most maps by 1991. One resident of Harrowwick, a retired postmistress named Leona Grant, described it best. "People don't forget Oakrest, they forget how they knew about it. It's like remembering a smell without knowing where you smelled it. That's what lingers, because Oakrest still exists. The walls still hold, the pews, if touched, would still creak. The altar remains, surrounded by candle stains and undisturbed dust. It's not a haunted house. There are no ghost stories, no local legends about children disappearing or lights in the windows. That would make it easier, cleaner. But Oakrest was never a place that screamed. It was a place that waited, and continues to wait. Today, hikers sometimes report a strange stillness near the old path. Cameras fail, compasses skew, no wildlife stirs. One teenager in 2003 described hearing a distant bell at night. His father, a regional game warden, shrugged it off. But when the boy returned alone and recorded a faint audio track from the woods, only one thing was audible: a rhythmic hum, rising and falling like breath. The sound file, reviewed by sound engineers, revealed reversed vocal cadence, matching the pattern of medieval monastic chant. The last line of the sonogram transcript reads, "It was a language not meant for us." And maybe that's the true horror, because this isn't a ghost story. It's a story of something built, authorized, funded, blessed, and then quietly hidden when it could no longer be controlled. Oakrest was never erased, it was paused. And if you were to find it now, if you followed that unmarked path past the old stone marker, half swallowed by vines, you would see it exactly as it was left. The wood, aged but whole. The bell tower, dark against the sky. The door still chained, but not locked. And if you waited, if you stood there long enough, when the hour turned midnight, you might hear the chant too, not in front of you, behind.